This tutorial is on the Canadian 1st Division and its fighting during the Italian campaign with a special significance on the Battle of Ortona. First we'll talk about the establishment of the Canadian Army in England, and then we'll talk about the beginning of the Italian campaign that took place in Sicily, the Italian campaign itself, and then what happened to the 1st Division after the Italian campaign. I've established this graphic to give you an indication of what did the war look like for Canada in the big picture. You can see that the Canadian Navy was mostly fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. The battle started right at the beginning of the war in September of 1939 and lasted all the way to the surrender of Germany in May of 1945. We've talked before about how the first 2/3 of that battle was not going well for the Canadians. In today's PowerPoint, we're going to talk about the 1st Division. If we look over here, you can see that Canada had 3 infantry divisions and it had 2 armored divisions. These colors are the colors of the shoulder patches that each division wore. You can see that the 1st Division was certainly engaged in the war for the longest. Right at the beginning of 1940, they embarked from Halifax aboard ships and traveled to England. They stayed in England training from 1940 up until the summer of 1943, when they finally saw action first at Sicily and then on to the mainland of Italy. We're going to talk specifically about the Battle of Ortona, which took place over Christmas of 1943. You can see that the other divisions arrived in England later. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Division were involved in D-Day, and the 5th Division helped to support the 1st Division. Down at the bottom, we can look at the Air Force and recognize that the Air Force was involved for most of the war, like the Navy. And we see here that the fighter squadrons started with the Battle of Britain, and then with the end of the Battle of Britain came the Blitz, and after the end of the Blitz, the bombing campaign on London and the other major cities in England. And then we see the beginning of the defense of Britain for the fighters and the night bombing campaign for the bombers. Okay, as far as today's lesson is concerned, let's not lose track of the big picture. The Canadian Army had, for the first 2/3 of the war, limited action. 2 Canadian battalions, about 2,000 men, saw action at Hong Kong. They were quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese, Christmas of 1941. And then the Canadian 2nd Division is involved in the one-day raid on Dieppe, which we'll talk about in another lesson. Other than that, the Canadian Army was mostly involved in establishing the Home Guard for England, and that allowed the English or the British regiments to be fighting overseas. At the beginning of the war, most of that fighting took place in North Africa. So Italy then is the first real land campaign for Canadian soldiers in the Second World War. We need to remember that after the fall of the island of Sicily, the Italian army very soon gave up, and that meant that the Canadians were fighting only German soldiers in Italy. And then finally, it's important to remember that the Canadians, while they were shock troops and had a wonderful reputation in the First World War, entered the Second World War with very little trained soldiers and very little equipment. So when they arrive in Italy, they are, although they've had years of training in England, they are rookie soldiers, and they're going to have to learn all of the hard lessons of battle. Okay, so if we talk about training in England, as I've said before, the Canadian soldiers were involved in the defense of Britain. Remember that the Germans had planned to invade England. That was the reason for the Battle of Britain. The Germans wanted to gain air superiority. And when the Battle of Britain was lost by the Germans, they eventually ended their plans for Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned invasion of England. So that meant that the Canadian forces in England in the years 1940, 41, 42, and 43 were involved in long months of fitness training to make themselves strong, and then battle drills and training on different weapon systems. The Canadians wanted to prove themselves. The Canadians had 2 sad outcomes at Hong Kong and at Dieppe, and the Canadian Army and the Canadian people wanted a chance for Canada to prove itself. Now in 1942, at the end of 1942, the British 8th Army under General Montgomery had finally defeated the German General Rommel and his Africa Corps, and that meant that the 8th Army, now positioned in North Africa, was ready to be relocated. And then lastly, and very importantly, we need to remember that at the Christmas of 1941, Germany turned on the Soviet Union and invaded the Soviet Union. And that meant that the USSR was receiving the brunt of German aggression. Stalin made repeated requests to the Allies, to America and to Britain, to open up a second front, therefore splitting the German military and relieving some of the pressure on the Soviet Union. Churchill wanted to invade Greece. The Americans wanted to invade Italy, and the Americans got their wish, and it was Italy that was invaded. This was called by Churchill the soft underbelly of Europe. The invasion of Sicily was called Operation Husky. You can see from the map that it involved forces from America, Great Britain, and Canada. The Canadian 1st Division was part of the British 8th Army, the victors at North Africa. On Sicily, the Allied soldiers came in contact with both Italian and German soldiers. Victories on Sicily were the first for Canada. The campaign lasted only 38 days, but in those 38 days, the Canadian soldiers marched about 120 miles across the island of Sicily. Now, the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, had insisted that a Canadian division participate in Operation Husky. He didn't want the Canadian soldiers just to be stuck in England. He wanted them to get involved in the fight. And the soldiers themselves wanted to get involved in the fight so that they could prove themselves. Now, on the 3rd of September 1943, so about 2.5 months after the invasion of Sicily, Sicily falls, and the Canadian 1st Division crosses the straits into Reggio in Italy. The Italian forces very quickly capitulated, and this of course made Mussolini very angry. He ended up moving into the north of Italy, and that means that for the most part the fight in Italy is against German soldiers almost from the beginning. Okay, the Germans conducted a series of tactical withdrawals. They would hold the line as long as they could, and then when the line couldn't be held, they would move backwards further north and reestablish a new strong point. And the Canadians and the other Allied soldiers, the Americans and the British, just slowly were pushing the Germans north in Italy. Now, in December, the Allies found themselves approaching Rome. The Germans set up what was called the Winter Line, but that name is a little bit of a misnomer because it wasn't really one line. It was a series of lines. Now, I've listed 3 of the most important lines on the map, but there were many others as well. In fact, the Caesar Line wasn't even one line. There was Caesar Line A, Caesar Line B, C, etc. So the Germans have 15 divisions, and these 15 divisions are established in a series of fortified lines. The idea of having lines in depth is that if one line falls, the defenders will quickly and easily be able to go back to a rear position and help to fortify that line as well. For the Canadians, it's significant that Hitler had given the order to General Kesselring, his commander in Italy, that he did not want the Winter Line to fall.